Hi everyone, my name is EWilson. I'm going to present the first half of chapter 12 in our book, which is really an overview of the three-dimensional analysis: structure, cultural, and craft. And all of these are required to make informed decision making that allows a public manager to be proactive instead of reactive. And they're very effective in problem solving. So this chapter kind of draws upon the various situations that a public manager might find themselves in and how to use the three-dimensional analysis to make the best decision. This includes reform, confronting a crisis, measuring performances amongst your employees, responding to early warnings. So there are some challenges, of course, in managing in this way. You can see them here. Some things to point out: that often public managers do not have all the information they need to make their informed decision. They're also asking their department to be accountable to the policy when it might indeed be chaotic, keeping in mind their employees' beliefs, values, the culture of the department, and respecting that. These are real scenarios that affect many people, and often their outcomes are determined by public managers. There's a real challenge for a public manager to find the right solution that provides long-term success. Do governing agencies block change, making it extra difficult for a manager? Do they have the resources they need to achieve the solutions that they took a long time to create? Does a manager have the skill, the natural leadership, the instinct? Are they motivated by the work that's being done? We can call this the public manager unicorn, because for one to excel in all three dimensions is very, very difficult. There are some systems in place to help a public manager make the best decision, while they might lean into one of the dimensions more than the other. So one example is craft is often used in a time of crisis. And the model deliberative process allows that manager to make a less intuitive decision based on instinct or intuition, and step back and look at the other two dimensions before making their full analysis. Now this can happen with early warnings. We hear about these all the time in the media, where the warnings were there. For example, a mentally ill person obtaining a gun legally and then doing something catastrophic. Broader picture, we can look at global warming as something that was talked about decades ago. And for public managers to take this information, which is ambiguous, speculative, doesn't offer any real timeline, and make an informed decision is almost impossible. They need to decide what's worthy of their consideration, what threats are worthy of considering, and which ones should be ignored. So they can use the connect the dots method, which is taking those little tidbits of information that have been received over time, and from there making a narrative and deciding if it's a real threat. So looking back at the histories, the patterns, and the past failures within the government can help make a more informed decision. We can look at, again, multiple examples that we see in the media all the time. But immediately assessing the threats does require some craft, but ultimately all 3D analysis is required to make a timely and effective response for a public manager. There are other ways that a public manager can make an effective response when they're intervening and diagnosing certain situations. So key is that all these different departments and jurisdictions need to come together to share information. They need to be able to communicate well. They need to have a system in place for that communication. There needs to be positive attitudes amongst managers so that they do cooperate and they do build trust. Again, a manager needs to be a natural-born leader to some extent and have the skills to know how to mobilize their pre-existing structures and cultures while they lean on craft. Public managers also have to often confront a crisis. And managing during a crisis, of course, is extra difficult. Again, keep in mind that they're under constant scrutiny, and public distrust of bureaucracy is at an all-time high. So they've got a lot working against them. To effectively confront a crisis, there needs to be a contingency plan in place, meaning these various departments and jurisdictions need to come together and create that plan, which can be done having response drills and simulations, and other methods to figure out what could happen in a real life scenario. And this requires negotiating amongst those jurisdictions, but they need to do that in order to come to a compromise. Creating a unified response for these teams will allow them to respond quickly when and if the crisis does come to light. So, not surprising that the book calls it an impossible job. Being a public manager is extremely difficult. So besides what has been previously mentioned, they also have these roadblocks against them. Public distrust, government possibly blocking their authority to enact the policies in place. Who deserves their support? Are they being altruistic? Are they holding true to an ideal within their agency that maybe isn't there, or maybe the public doesn't view as being there? So the fire department, they're held to high esteem in almost all communities across the country, but the police department unfortunately is not. So it's making that job for a police officer even more difficult, right, Phil? And there is such a thing as an impossible job. You can see that here, that to the right, many of these qualities make a job in public management very, very difficult. Burnout is very high in these types of jobs. Public support isn't there. Support within your own department isn't there. Maybe the money isn't there either. And then the mission's weak on top of it. So the example the book provides is the secretary for the California Department of Correction. He only lasted 2 years. His job was very difficult because he received no support from anyone. Those who worked with him, for him, against him, his own boss, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the budget wasn't there as well. So the book analyzed that this person probably leaned too heavily into craft, trusting the structure and the culture that were in place were effective when they were not. And he might have leaned too heavily into one approach and not the full 3D analysis approach. And a public manager, at the end of the day, they manage people, which is human resources. A public manager, they have the duty and the honor to hire employees, but also to let them go, to reward them, to discipline them when required. They also, using the 3D approach, can have more flexibility. They can create an office with discernment and incentives like performance pay, which might create a better performing department. And it all comes down to the golden rule. A public manager should treat their employees as they themselves want to be treated. If they want to earn respect, they need to give respect. So I love this part of the book because at the end of the day, that is what it comes down to. And lastly, before I pass this off to Tiana, there are some reforms within public management that fall into two kind of distinct categories. Public managers really are change agents. They don't always get the credit that they deserve. The changes that they make behind the scene are minuscule and sometimes not noticed, but really they do enact effective policy change. So as our more well-known bureaucratic officials receive a lot of attention, and that comes down to the policy being enacted by the manager behind the scenes can make little changes that create new best practices. And actually, at the end of the day, theorists agree, make a more impactful change. And reform can be political. Again, bureaucracy or bureaucrats, they do not have a lot of public trust at this moment. And starting at the top down, that frustration gets pushed squarely onto the shoulders of a public manager who then has to enact this policy that sometimes there's dilemmas, there's biases. What policies need to be held accountable more than others? Are they conflicting with one another? And a public manager can sometimes make those decisions without too much attention being drawn onto them. These deliberate changes in structure allow them to meet the objective in a better way without maybe quite as much notice. And with that, I pass it on.